Grimora.
Snow had been falling through the afternoon in a slow, steady pattern that covered the back roads and softened the outline of the trees. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, dark trunks rising out of a white surface that had no clear edge. A narrow, unpaved road cut through the woods and ended at a small cabin set back from a frozen creek. Smoke moved weakly from the metal chimney and disappeared into the thick air. Avery Lang stood at the cabin window and watched the forest fade into the early winter evening. The nearest town was 20 miles away. The cabin had belonged to his grandfather and had passed into the family as a place for short visits, hunting trips, and quiet weekends. This year, Avery and his younger sister Lena had decided to spend Christmas there for the first time. They had arrived that morning with boxes of supplies, a small artificial tree, and an idea that a silent holiday might help them reset after a long year. Inside, the cabin held a main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and 2 narrow bedrooms. The generator behind the cabin provided power for a few lamps and a radio, but the signals were weak and the station drifted in and out. Snow began to fall harder by late afternoon. The clouds lowered, and the forest seemed to move closer, as if the line of trees had leaned forward slightly while no one was watching. Lena stacked firewood next to the stove and checked the metal door to make sure it latched correctly. The heat spread unevenly, leaving the corners of the room cooler than the center. She mentioned that they should bring in extra logs before the storm thickened, since she did not want to step into deep snow in the middle of the night. Avery agreed and pulled on his boots and coat. When he opened the cabin door, the air outside felt heavier than earlier. The snow came down in small, dense flakes that gathered quickly on the porch steps. The sky held no visible stars. The trees stood in careful rows, their branches holding a thin layer of white. Avery walked to the covered woodpile beside the cabin and filled his arms. Before he turned back, he glanced at the open space that separated the cabin from the tree line. The ground was smooth and unmarked. No tracks led toward the cabin. No animal prints crossed the clearing. Only the new snow lay there, untouched. He went inside, set the logs by the stove, and secured the door. By the time darkness settled over the forest, the road had disappeared, and the cabin became a small, isolated shape in an unbroken field of white and shadow. They ate a simple meal and listened to the radio until the station's signal faded completely. The generator hummed with a steady, low vibration. The wind moved around the cabin in slow intervals. Around 9 in the evening, Lena went to her room with a book and an extra blanket. Avery stayed in the main room and watched the last light sink into the trees through the front window. He noticed something as his eyes adjusted to the dark. The snow in the clearing reflected a faint ambient light from the hidden sky. Against that surface, any disturbance should have been visible as dark marks. Now there were none. The field remained smooth and continuous up to the first line of trees. He checked the latch on the door again and added 1 more log to the fire. Sometime after he lay down in his own small room, sleep drifted in and out in thin layers. The cabin creaked as old wood responded to the cold. The stove settled. The wind pressed against the roof. In the middle of the night, without knowing the exact time, Avery woke with a clear sense that something small had changed. There was a sound in the distance. It did not resemble the wind or the normal shifting of the structure. It came as a soft pattern, then stopped, then returned after a gap. He lay still and listened. The sound repeated. It reminded him of steps in snow, measured and deliberate, but far away. Each sequence was short, followed by a pause equal in length. He sat up slowly and waited for his breathing to steady. The sound continued, moving in direction, but not volume. It seemed to circle the cabin once, then drift away toward the trees, then return. The steps were too even and slow to belong to an animal. They lacked the irregular rhythm of a person moving quickly. They sounded like someone walking with care, leaving each mark with intention. He stood and walked quietly to the small front window. The glass showed only his reflection at first, then the whiteness of the snow and the dark line of the forest. The steps continued, now slightly clearer. He pressed his palm to the cold glass and leaned closer. At the edge of the clearing, just before the first row of trees, a line of footprints appeared. They had not been there earlier. The prints formed a neat, single path leading from the deeper part of the forest toward the cabin, then curving, then beginning to complete a half circle. No figure moved in the open area. The air in the clearing was empty. Only the footprints changed, lengthening one by one, as if an unseen presence walked across the surface. He watched until the line reached a point directly in front of the cabin, then angled away again toward the trees. When the line reached the far edge of his view, the sound of the steps faded. The snow kept falling, soft and constant. No wind moved the prints. They stayed clear and dark against the white surface. Avery did not turn on a lamp. He remained at the window for several minutes, tracking each detail. The footprints were deep enough to suggest an adult weight. The spacing was regular. The orientation of the prints indicated someone walking from forest to clearing and back, not running, not stumbling. No prints led out from the cabin. Nothing suggested that a physical person had come from the road. The only visible pattern came from the trees. He considered waking Lena, but he let the thought pass. The situation did not carry an immediate visible threat. The prints existed as a fact, and nothing moved now. He returned to bed and lay awake for a long time, listening for any new sound. None came. At some point, he drifted into a light sleep. Morning brought a gray light through low cloud cover. The storm had slowed to a light, steady fall. Avery dressed and moved quietly through the cabin. Lena was still asleep. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. Cold air settled against his face. The clearing lay before him. The footprints were clearly visible. They formed a long arc that began at a point between two thick trees, crossed the open space toward the cabin, passed within 10 feet of the porch, then angled back toward another part of the tree line. Each print retained sharp definition. Snow had settled around them, but not filled them in. Avery walked down the steps and approached the nearest mark.
The shape of the impression indicated boots similar to his own, but slightly narrower. Each print was aligned in a straightforward direction, no dragging, no sign of disturbance other than weight. He followed the arc halfway across the clearing, then stopped. The line leading into the trees ended abruptly at the very edge of the forest. No prints continued between the trunks. It was as if the one who had walked had stepped out from somewhere beyond the trees, crossed the open ground, and then stepped back into the same point without disturbing the snow further. He traced the line in the other direction. The same pattern held at the opposite end. The prints began at the tree line without any shallower initial marks. They started at full depth, crossed the clearing, and returned. Avery stood at the edge of the trees and looked inward. The snow beneath the branches was smoother than the open ground, as if the canopy had shielded it from most of the storm. There were no signs of entry or exit inside. By then, Lena had woken and watched him from the porch. She asked what he was doing, using a neutral tone. Avery described the footprints as he saw them and pointed to the ends at the tree line. She came down the steps and walked carefully around the nearest impressions. She studied the pattern for a long moment. Then she mentioned that their grandfather had once talked about strange tracks that had appeared in the clearing on winter holidays when he stayed here alone. He had never given details, and the family had treated the stories as a kind of seasonal superstition. Avery had not heard that version before. Lena said that she had listened at the edge of adult conversations and remembered fragments. They both stood at the border of the forest and listened. The woods were quiet. No wind moved through the branches. No animals stirred. The air felt dense and still. The day passed in measured tasks. They cleared the porch steps, checked the generator fuel, and kept the fire steady. Snow continued in small amounts, filling only part of the footprints. Toward afternoon, the impressions remained visible, but softened at the edges. By evening, the line no longer stood out as sharply. Avery found that he watched the clearing more often than before, preparing himself for any shift. As night approached, the sky darkened early behind the low clouds. The radio could not pick up any stations. The only sound inside the cabin was the low movement of the stove and the occasional shift of wood. They decided to stay up later than usual, with a plan to observe the clearing after midnight from inside. They did not discuss the underlying reason in detail. It sat between them like a quiet agreement. Around 11:30, they turned off most lamps and let the fire and one small bulb near the window provide light. The snow reflected enough ambient glow that the clearing and the first line of trees were visible again. The previous footprints had almost vanished under new accumulation. The surface was nearly smooth once more. When the small clock on the shelf moved past midnight, the cabin felt suddenly more still. The sounds of the stove and the generator seemed softer, as if muffled by an additional layer of air. Avery and Lena stood near the window and watched the clearing. For a few minutes, nothing changed. Then the sound began again. It arrived in the same pattern as the night before, faint at first, like someone walking at a distance. The steps were evenly spaced. With each cycle, they gained a small degree of clarity. Avery and Lena remained still, standing just far enough back from the glass to see without reflection. The footprints appeared in the snow, one after another, forming a path from the tree line towards the cabin. No figure accompanied them. The air above the new impressions was empty. Still, each print deepened as if something unseen had settled its weight into the surface and then lifted away. The path came closer to the cabin this time. The line reached a point just 5 feet from the porch. The sound of each step seemed to pass through the wall rather than around it. Avery felt a subtle vibration in the floor under his feet, not strong enough to move anything, just enough to register as contact. The prints paused in place. For several long seconds, no new print formed. The sound stopped. In that pause, both Avery and Lena sensed a focus directed towards the cabin, as clear as being watched from close range. The feeling was not aggressive and not welcoming. It resembled recognition, as if something that knew the cabin well had returned to confirm that someone else now occupied it. Then the steps resumed, moving away towards the trees. The prince extended across the clearing and stopped exactly where the forest began. No further disturbance occurred in the snow under the branches. The sound faded. They stayed by the window until the pattern completed and the clearing grew still again. After a while, Avery spoke in a quiet tone and said that the presence seemed tied to the place rather than to them specifically. Lena nodded and mentioned that their grandfather had always returned here in winter, even when others in the family avoided it, as if he accepted some ongoing cycle that belonged to the land. They did not go outside until morning. When daylight came, the second set of footprints remained visible, leading from and returning to the same points at the tree line. The depth and spacing matched the previous night exactly. By noon, clouds began to break and faint light touched the upper branches of the forest. The air held a slight change that suggested the storm would finally lessen. Avery stood once more at the edge of the trees and looked inward. The snow within the forest remained smooth and undisturbed. The footprints ended at the border, as if whoever made them existed only in the open ground between the cabin and the line of trees. That afternoon, while adding another piece of wood to the stove, Avery found an old notebook in a drawer near the kitchen. The pages contained short entries in his grandfather's handwriting. Most dealt with weather, repairs, and hunting details. A few lines written years apart mentioned the same date at the end of December. The notes on those pages were brief. They described prints in the snow that started at the trees and circled the cabin, always in night, always in winter. In the last entry that referenced the date, his grandfather had written that the prince appeared most often when someone stayed at the cabin alone. He had added that the presence never tried the door and never approached the windows closer than a few feet. The pattern was simple and consistent. It began, repeated, and faded as if bound to a distance it would not cross. Avery closed the notebook and set it back. Outside, the footprints slowly changed shape as wind picked up and small loose snow shifted across the clearing. By evening, the impressions were almost gone. Only the knowledge of their path remained clear. He understood that if they returned next year at the same time, the pattern would likely repeat. The footprints would likely lead out from the trees, cross the clearing, pause near the cabin, and then return along the same invisible line. Whatever walked there would continue to move in that narrow space, present but not visible, waiting for snow and darkness to arrive again over the forest.